Welcome back to my channel. This week we're going to be doing a watercolor pencil tutorial. So we're going to be going step by step with 6 different techniques, and then we're going to be applying those techniques to this illustration. As you can see, I've already done an initial wash using just regular watercolor, not watercolor pencils. You can learn how to make this palette in one of my previous YouTube videos, which I will link in the cards. The watercolor pencils we're going to be using today are the Crayola watercolor pencils. So, all that being said, I think we should just get started. So, a common thing I see with watercolor pencils that people complain about is that when they draw onto the paper, they have a hard time then rubbing away those streaks. Now, those streaks can be something you want, and it all has to do with the amount of pressure you press into the paper when you're using your pencil. So we're gonna play around with a hard, medium, and a light pressure with the pencil. So on this one, I'm gonna go hard. So I'm pushing pretty firmly. Now, what's the point of using hard pressure? Maybe you're creating a texture that you want to keep visible. You'll see here in a moment, once I throw some water on top of these lines, that it can create an interesting texture or pattern in your piece. And as I go over it, those initial lines stay present. So then next, we're going to do a medium pressure. Just like as if I were writing, like if I were just writing, you know, just a normal pressure. Now on this, you might get some residual lines, but for the most part, they're gonna wash away. Let's see how it looks. The more you go over it like this, the more it will dissolve. Also, in case you're curious what pen I'm using, as you'll see, it's not bleeding. It's an alcohol-based pen. It's the Pigma Micron pens. I have it written down here. As you can see, the lines are a little bit lighter. They don't pop out as much as like the hard pressure. And now, let's go in with light pressure. So I'm just gonna barely touch the paper. I find, you know, multiple layers but light pressure is kind of the way to go with this. Yeah, as I said, one of the biggest complaints is people can't get rid of those lines, and it's pretty easy to tell that they're just pressing too hard. But like I said, that can also be used to your advantage. But as you can see, all of those lines are pretty much disappearing. But if you really wanted to fill in an area and not get all those lines and pressure, you would probably do something sort of like this. You would want to kind of just fill it in. You know, do a little bit of a swirly texture, something like that. And then you want to get it wet. You're going to get a little bit more pigment this way. And wow, look, most of those lines are in fact gone. As you can see, is the difference between doing hard, medium, and light pressure. A little less pigment, but once this layer dries, you can keep building up the pencil and building up the opacity, building up the saturation. Bada bing, bada boom. Now, let's go ahead and jump over to me using these techniques on our illustration. Alright, we're going to start out with the hard pressure, and using that to our advantage. And I'm just going to put some stripes on it, using a pretty firm texture. One thing I like about these watercolor pencils is that, you know, I feel like I have a little bit more control over them than a regular paintbrush, as someone who is usually working with pencils, not too much paint. I feel like this is a good way to get into it. Carl, you know, you were here last video, and you're here again for this video. You gotta stop video bombing You're just trying to drink my paint water. Come on. So now that I have all my hard pressed outlines in here, maybe I'm gonna do some light pressure here around the edge just to help us define it a little bit, but once I add water, those will blur out just a bit. And then I'm just gonna kind of lightly run my brush across this. And I'm gonna use that saturation to my advantage and kind of turn it into a light shading per se. So there's not a lot of use for medium pressure, it just kind of looks awkward, but I think if you're going hard pressure or you're going light pressure, there's lots of uses. So let's go ahead and see light pressure. I'm going to do that here with the volleyball. I'm just going to kind of lightly fill in the top yellow. Now the light pressure is best for whenever you're doing simple washes of color. And then the red on this side, just typical volleyball or beach ball stuff. Simple as that. Clean up my brush a bit, and then you dampen it, and it's going to give you that watercolor texture as opposed to your typical pencil texture. Alright, now that we've seen that, let's go ahead and play around with another technique. So you have the technique of having the water wet before you touch it with the pencil. And then there's the technique of having the pencil wet before you put it on the paper. So let's start with a pre-wet paper. So this is going to give you really soft lines. As you can see, it definitely still has a very watercolor effect without looking too pencil-y, while the edges are really nice and soft and sort of faded out. It's kind of like when you've written pen and the paper gets wet and it kind of smudges. It's a good way to get some fine line details without them looking too pencil-y. Yeah, this honestly really looks like a ballpoint pen. Alright, so that's that technique. And then down here, if you pre-wet the pencil, so I'm going to get different color, and I'm just going to take my water, I'm going to dip it in there, tap it off, and I like to let it soak in a little bit, especially this pencil was just dry. Once they get a little wet and they get used to it, it's okay. Then I'm going to dip it again, dab off. Just want to give it a second to saturate. Alright, and then I can write on here with it. With like a similar look as above, you know, in terms of having a nice faded out line. However, it's not going to fade into the colors next to it like above did. You have to keep wetting it because it does have a tendency to dry off. But I think it can create some really like very saturated color. Let's go ahead and use these two techniques on our illustration. So our next technique is the pre-wet paper. Let's go ahead, I'm going to fill it in. I'm going to take my brown. I'm just going to go over those lines that I created. And then I believe over time that's going to kind of fade a little bit. I can't help but want to go in there with the small brush and kind of give it a kickstart. Especially this area over here. I want this to be a little more shaded than the rest. So the next technique is a pre-wet and pencil. And I think I want the base of the flip-flops to be white. And the idea is I'm going to create these nice saturated polka dots all over it. And created some nice little dots. They're very hyperpigmented. I think that's one of the biggest upsides of this technique. You're getting nice, thick, opaque paint. So I'm going to go in with a darker blue and do the same thing, but I'm going to fill in the little flip-flop straps. Alright, so now that we have those techniques out of the way, let's go ahead and talk a little bit more about logistics, color mixing. I mean, these watercolor pencils come in quite a variety of colors, so there's not much need for mixing, but it's not impossible. So I'm going to go pretty classic here, and I'm going to do like red and yellow. So we're going to have, let's see if we want to do like a red to yellow gradient. Start yellow. So I want to start a little bit more layered pigmentation at the top and then slowly fade out, just like imagine you were drawing with colored pencils. How would you want to gradient the two colors together? Same. I'm doing more of a light touch, but I'm just doing multiple layers of that light touch, and then slowly fade out towards the yellow. And then another way to do this would just be throwing down some red, throwing some yellow on top of it. Awesome. So let's go ahead, and I want to start with yellow to red because red is the more dominant color here, and it'll easily take over the yellow. So start at yellow. See how when you add water, it just like instantly activates it. And then we'll just keep stroking. When we get to the bottom, look at that. I think that's a pretty nice fade. We can kind of take it back a bit. There we go. So I think that's a nice gradient. Just layering these two colors in one spot, not really trying to do a gradient, just out here trying to make an orange. Let's see how that looks. Mixy. There you go. It's an orange. I mean, if that ain't orange, I don't know what orange is. So, yeah, as you can see, it's pretty simple to do some color mixing. Okay, so now that you've seen color mixing and gradients, let's go ahead and apply those techniques to our illustration. I think I'm gonna do something a little challenging here and do the gradient on the octopus. Maybe if he starts out a red violet. Slowly fade this down the tentacles. Now keeping it a little bit more pigmented at the bottom. Right, I think I want to do a little extra oomph up here. And grab my paintbrush and do like we did before. I'm going to start with the lighter, less dominant color and then move into the darker one. We're starting to hit some of that purple. Alright, I think in order for this gradient to have been a little more successful as an example, I should have picked two colors that were a little bit more different in tone. I'm going to do another gradient, but this time on a fish. Doing on a really small scale. I just need to prove myself. It's a little bit harder to do a gradient when it's not just a rectangle. Yeah. Nice little gradient on that little fishy guy. So the next technique is doing fine details on a wash, or more or less what I mean by this is using the watercolor pencils as a fine liner. I think it's a pretty common thing people like to do, is use their watercolor pencils as a fine liner just to keep your medias in the same sphere. Sometimes, you know, when you're doing all these nice delicate color works, you don't really want to go in there with a black fine liner. It can kind of throw off the balance. So, alright, my little blue blob is now dry. So I want to go in with a blue that's slightly darker. Hold on. Yeah, that should work. And I can just literally fine line this as if, you know, just basically using it as a pencil. Now, this is when, you can take these two techniques into consideration. Do you want to fine line it and get that pencily texture? Or do you want to fine line it with the pre-wet paper or the pre-wet pencil technique? It's really up to you and what's going to look good and best in your opinion. Give this weird blob a face. So here's a clip of me doing that technique on my illustration. So, I talked about doing fine detail with the pencils. So we're going to go back to this beach ball. And I'm going to redefine those little stitches in the ball using the pencil. Yeah, it's basically how you'll define it. I think at the end, if you stick around, seeing how the octopus comes out will be fun for everyone. So I am officially done with my little summer illustration. I hope you like it. I had a bit of an issue with my masking tape rubbing at my paper, despite me putting it down on my clothes to make it less sticky. Whatever, it's fine. Yeah, it's just a casual little drawing. Might end up putting it up on my Redbubble. Oop, realized I didn't outline this guy. Might end up putting it up on my Redbubble. If you're interested in it, go check out my Redbubble, link in the description. Also realizing I didn't write out the word sunscreen there. Little things. Little things. So yeah. I think it's pretty cute. I hope you like it. Tune in next week for some more art content. See you then.